Self-relation leads to fragmentation, while self-transcendence leads to unity. In his magnum opus, The Pillar and Ground of the Truth, Father Pavel Florensky critiques the law of identity, which is formulated as A equals A. He calls the law of identity the principle of rationality. Now, the problem with the law of identity isn't necessarily the fact that it says that beings are self-identical, because, of course, beings are self-identical, but it's the fact that it grounds self-identity in self-relation. It says that A is fully exhausted in A itself, but this is purely a tautology, and it doesn't recognize the fact that even within the formula of A equals A itself, B is implied, because A can only be A if it is not B. So you see how otherness is immanent to the very identity of A, so that you can't have A without B. And this points to the Orthodox Christian ontology of communion, which states that being is not self-identity in the sense of self-relation, but being is communion. We receive our being from God, and then to enter into the fullness of being is to return the being we have been given back to God and establish a relationship of dialogical reciprocity. In the absence of this dialogue, there can only be hell, because hell is the abyss of self-isolation. To be completely separated from dialogical reality, which is just objective reality, means to be completely trapped within the abyss of your own self-isolation. Something that Florensky talks about is the fact that rationality encounters antinomies everywhere. And that's precisely because it cannot grasp the higher order logic of communion. It's always stuck within this faulty logic of A equals A, without recognizing that A also requires B. Now, the fundamental antinomy of self-relation is the fact that self-relation ends in fragmentation or self-division. This antinomy is completely incomprehensible to fallen rationality, because fallen rationality sees the essence of being, it sees the essence of identity as self-relation. But this is failing to see how A always requires B, and being is communion. We can also formulate this antinomy by saying that trying to make oneself the center of reality leads to constant decentering. It leads to us becoming fragmented from reality, but also internally fragmented. It leads to an internal self-division. And this internal self-division is what's more difficult to understand and to grasp. But I think a way we can do so is by analyzing the ultimate symbol of self-relation, which is the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail. Now, one thing that G.K. Chesterton notes is the fact that the serpent eating its own tail is a very unsatisfactory meal. And what this is pointing to is the fact that self-consumption doesn't lead to some positivity. It doesn't lead to entering into the fullness of life, but it ends in self-negation. It results in self-negation. It is self-consumption. It is taking the life that you have and directing it towards nothingness. It's directing it towards yourself, towards the fiction of self-relation. Now, the Ouroboros is actually a logically impossible image, because if the Ouroboros were to eat its whole self, nothing would remain. But of course, this isn't possible because the mouth can't eat itself. So if you actually take the Ouroboros to its fullest conclusion, you just get a gaping mouth which has nothing left to eat. It is this pure hellish existence that has completely separated itself both from otherness, but also from itself. And here we see why self-relation leads to internal fragmentation. It's because self-relation, or the attempt to self-relate, which manifests in as a spiritual reality with pride and with sin, and all sin is ultimately derivative of pride. It's ultimately different manifestations of pride. So self-relation ends in fragmentation because self-relation is self-consumption. So you are constantly devouring yourself, fragmenting yourself, while self-transcendence leads to a communion where your identity is established in and through the other. Now, the way this can be explained is by looking to God himself, by looking to the Trinity. In Christian theology, God is a Trinity, which means that he is tri-personal, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and all three persons are equally God. Now, what I want to talk about here is how God knows himself. Because there's a paradox that you'll inevitably run into when you try to conceive of self-knowledge through self-relation. Because think about the subject thinking about itself. Now, it can never actually think about itself as it truly is, because in order to reflect upon itself, there needs to be a subject that is doing the reflecting. Now, if there's a subject doing the reflecting, that subject can't be included within the reflection. It would be like an eyeball trying to gaze back at itself. And I see no reason why this shouldn't apply to God himself, because it's just a logical reality. It's the fact that any self-relating understanding of knowledge leads to incompleteness. The fact that the knower has to be left out of the picture. The knower has to be distinct from the knowledge itself. But you get around this paradox with the Trinity, because the Father doesn't know himself through solipsistic self-reflection, but through seeing himself in his perfect image, which is the Son, and he sees himself through the Spirit. And it's through this Trinitarian self-reflection that God can know himself fully, that all three persons can know themselves and the others fully, because the Father gives himself fully to the Son, and then the Son gives himself back to the Father. So you have this perfect mutual interiority, right? And therefore, the Father can see himself because he's seeing himself in the Son. He's seeing himself in another who is, and this other is able to see the Father as he truly is, right? So you can now, to go with the analogy of the eyeballs, you have one eyeball and then you have another eyeball. This eyeball can fully see the other eyeball, but this eyeball itself alone can't see itself, obviously. But the way the Trinity works is that through the Spirit, right? And I have a whole video on the necessity of the Holy Spirit, so I don't want to explain that here. So I suggest watching that video if you want to know why God has to be triune and not just two persons. But anyways, this eyeball can see this eyeball in totality, and this eyeball can see this eyeball in totality. So if you have a full mutual interiority, if you have a sharing of perspectives here, then both can see themselves, because the Father is seeing himself in the Son. And this is how knowledge and reflection is understood within the communal ontology. It's never self-relating, because self-relating always leads to ignorance. It always leads to an inability to actually see yourself. But if you see yourself in and through the other, then you can actually have knowledge of yourself. And within the logic of rationality, within the logic of A equals A, this is an antinomy. It's fundamentally impossible to understand how, within this framework, how self-transcendence, with how self-forgetting can actually lead to you finding yourself. But within the communal ontology, this is perfectly accounted for. Now, just to conclude, I want to briefly talk about a story from the Gospels, which I think perfectly demonstrates everything I've been talking about so far. And that story is the story of the demoniac in the Gerasenes, which Christ confronts. Now, basically how the story goes, Christ goes to this place called the Gerasenes, and there's a demoniac there. And this demoniac can't be controlled by anyone, and it's just wild and violent and doing, whatever demoniacs do. And Christ confronts this demoniac, and Christ and the demoniac refers to himself in the singular, right? So the demoniac calls himself a he, and Christ, I'm pretty sure Christ calls him a you. And then when Christ asks the demoniac what is his name, then we have this complete fracturing into legion, into a swarm of demons. And we see how actually the singular demoniac is possessed by multiple demons. And I think at a spiritual level, how we should interpret this is by seeing that the pride of the demons leads to fragmentation. It leads to schizophrenia. Their attempts to make themselves the center of reality, to claim divinity for themselves, this actually leads to fragmentation. It leads to this meaningless swarm of legion. Now, I'm not going to talk about this anymore because Nate and I did a full podcast on this story, analyzing it verse by verse on the Theosbound channel. So if you want to hear more about this, I would highly suggest checking out that podcast episode. And with that, that's basically all I have to say on this topic. The reason, just to summarize this video, I wanted to demonstrate how self-relation and the ontology of self-relation is ultimately self-refuting, because self-relation can never ground identity. Self-relation actually leads to the dissolution of identity. It leads to the Ouroboros consuming itself, negating itself. It leads to us conceiving of identity in the singular, in isolation, when even in the formula A equals A, you see the necessity of B, because A cannot be itself without B. So A requires B. Identity requires distinction, and the fullness of identity requires communion, which is the full mutual interiority of multiple identities together in this unity that preserves the distinction nonetheless. And we see this unity in distinction in its highest form with the triune God. So yeah, that's basically all I have to say on this topic. Again, if you want to learn more about it, I highly suggest checking out our podcast on Legion. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. And also join our Discord server, because there's a lot of great discussions and resources there. So yeah, again, thank you for watching, and may God bless you all.